السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين ناصر المستضعفين قاهر الجبابرة الطواغيت الظالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، اللهم انفعنا بما علمتنا وعلمنا ما ينفعنا وزدنا علما وفقها في الدين يا رب العالمين. We praise Allah that Allah Azza wa Jalla has once again given us this opportunity to continue to study this important part of our current and modern history and of the first Qibla and the land surrounding it, of the second masjid that was built for the worship of Allah, and of the third most holiest piece of land on the surface of this earth. May Allah Azza wa Jalla enable us to continue to understand these important events that took place. So last week we discussed the impacts of the Declaration of Principles that were agreed as part of Oslo number 1 in September 1993, and as part of the agreement was the end of the first Intifada, the Stone Intifada. Thereafter, in response, about 10 groups who did not agree with the agreement that was made at that time. So in December 1993, the alliance of Palestinian forces was announced from the capital of Syria, Damascus, and they denounced Oslo, declared that the PLO was not representative of the Palestinian people, and they made unilateral, or rather they just negotiated by themselves, claiming to be on behalf of the Palestinians, and also that the terms of the DOP were not binding on the Palestinians. So these were 10 groups. From amongst them were the Islamic resistance movements, as well as the famous movement which we discussed at the beginning, the popular resistance movement. Thereafter, the resistance continued. In 16th of April 1993 was a change, as that was when the bombings started against Israeli targets. So Israeli soldiers were targeted in the Mehola Junction bombing, and thereafter the bombings continued. After 1993, the Palestinian Authority was required by the DOP to try and assess, or was required to arrest the leaders of the resistance, and so they slowly started to build their security forces at that time. Then on the 25th of February 1994 was the Masjid al-Khalil massacre. We discussed this in a bit of detail last week. In English, the Cave of Patriarchs, or Al-Haram al-Ibrahimi, where Baruch Goldstein, originally from the US, a physician, he went wearing his IDF uniform into the masjid in Fajr in Ramadan, where 800 Muslims were performing Salah. He opened fire, killed 29, immediately 125 wounded. Then in the events that followed, as the Muslims left, etc., and demonstrations, altogether 69 Muslims were killed. Goldstein was beaten and killed in the masjid. And there were a number of eyewitnesses and reports that the IDF, or a number of soldiers of the IDF, were complicit in the killing of the Palestinians in the masjid. And the reaction was condemned in terms of the government and the governmental figures and the political figures, the main leadership. However, he was a member of a political party, the Catch Party. That party was then banned, but then from that party another party was born, as we said, of which now the couple of ministers in the current Israeli government are members of the party which was originally the Catch Party, with the same ideology. However, the Zionist fundamentalists, they praised the operation or the action that he did, the massacre that he carried out. His place, or his grave, became a place of pilgrimage, and he was regarded as a hero. Obviously, in retaliation, the Palestinian resistance carried out a number of bombings, so that took place not long. So from 25th of February, the bombings took place on the 6th and the 13th of April 1994, and thereafter the resistance put forward a policy that if the Israelis continue to kill civilians, then their civilians will not be a red line in terms of attacks. Once they stop killing civilians, then their civilians will return back to being a red line. So this was a change in policy. Until then, only Israeli security forces or the military, etc., had been targeted. And then from 1994 to 1997, the resistance continued, the bombings continued, the Israeli repression continued, arrests, assassinations, houses being destroyed, interrogations, torture, people being wanted and having to live in hiding, collective punishment. We mentioned sealed areas, nobody's allowed to move in, nobody's allowed to go out, control of all kinds of movement, people being banned from going to work, etc., restrictions on working. And at the same time, the Oslo Peace process continued. There were meetings taking place between the PLO, Yasser Arafat and his representatives, and the representatives of the Israeli government, which then culminated in the second Oslo II, as it was known as, in 1995. So on 28th of September 1995, an agreement took place. So it took place in a place in Egypt called Taba. And so it was also called the Taba Agreement. So this was between the previous one in 1993 and this one. There were also a number of other agreements that took place. Some in September, some in 1994. A number of months. There was a Cairo agreement that took place in 1994. So there were a number of agreements that took place between that time. But the main agreement that took place in this period was the second one was on the 28th of September 1995. In Egypt, and again it was Yasser Arafat, Yitzhak Rabin, and Bill Clinton came over to be a witness on the agreement. Now, in response to this movement and this action of Yitzhak Rabin in starting this, what was known as a peace process, with the PLO, there was a backlash, which we briefly mentioned, in amongst the Zionist fundamentalists. And so there were rabbis who gave edicts of the death penalty for those who hand over Jewish property and lives to the enemy. And at that time, Benjamin Netanyahu was the leader of the opposition. And the previous year, when the Cairo agreement took place, on the 4th of May 1994, the day before, Benjamin Netanyahu made a statement. From part of what he said, that in another hour, Rabin will be able to announce that in Cairo he established a Palestinian terrorist state. So now they're accusing their own prime minister of establishing a Palestinian terrorist state. Ariel Sharon, the notorious Ariel Sharon, he said that I never believed the day would come when a Jewish government in Jerusalem would deal with selecting which Jews would be protected and which Jews should be thrown to the dogs. And he almost equated Yitzhak Rabin to the Nazis as part of his statement. Anyway, there were a number of different statements. Eventually, on the 4th of November 1995, so not long after the September 1995 agreement, or Oslo II, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Zionist fundamentalist. And when he was asked why did you do this, he said, I wanted to stop the peace process. And a number of rabbis had given a fatwa, edict of the death to the one who has betrayed the Jews. And so this was the assassination of Rabin in November 1995. As part of the agreement that took place, we looked at this map last week, just a reminder. So the West Bank, as part of this 1995 agreement, would be split into three areas. Area A, B, and C. Area A, which is 18%, the light blue, would be administered by the Palestinian Authority. So this is what they would have authority over. Whereas Area B, which is 22%, that would be administered in part by the Palestinian Authority, but the security control would be shared with the Israeli armed forces and the Israeli security forces. So that's 40%. The rest of the 60% would be totally administered by the Israeli authorities, administration, security, everything. And as you can see, that's the whole border with Jordan, as well as the border with 1948 territories that were occupied by the Israeli government, etc. So the whole of the areas which are Palestinian administered are all completely surrounded by the Israeli administration and Israeli security forces. So despite the wording or the UN resolutions being that the whole of the West Bank should be under Palestinian control and part of a Palestinian state, in fact, in reality, they only had total control over, if you could say total control, over 18% of the West Bank. And even that wasn't total control, it was just civil administration and security forces. Obviously, this was rejected by the groups, as we mentioned previously, the alliance that had been set up in Damascus rejected, again, obviously, the agreement that was made in 1995. After the assassination of Rabin, we have Shimon Peres, who takes on the role of interim prime minister for a few months until May 1996. And then in May 1996, there are elections, and in the elections, they don't vote for his party, and everyone votes for Benjamin Netanyahu, and Netanyahu then becomes the prime minister of Israel from 1995. This term is from 1995 until 1999. Now, before he becomes prime minister, in the interim period, Shimon Peres announces Operation Grapes of Wrath, and this is on the 11th of April 1996, so just before the elections. And this was a 16-day invasion of Lebanon in response to Katyusha rocket attacks by Hezbollah and the other groups, mainly Hezbollah in Lebanon. As an impact of this invasion, we have over 400,000 Lebanese and some Palestinians or the residents in Lebanon who are displaced, and they're going to different camps. It's a 16-day invasion, and they have to go to different camps. They are dispersed. They all have to leave their villages. They all have to leave their homes. And in one of the, obviously, the number of massacres that took place, but the famous massacre that took place at this time was the Kafr Camp massacre. And this took place in southern Lebanon, near a town called Qana. And this was a UN compound housing refugees. A UN compound housing refugees. It was called the Kafr Camp. And the Israeli forces bombed this refugee camp, killing over 160 of the refugees living in this camp. So over 160 were killed by the Israeli forces just in this one camp. Anyway, so for 16 days the operation goes on until eventually they call an end to the operation, saying that they have fulfilled their objectives of reducing the capacity and of the forces in Lebanon for shooting Katyusha rockets into the 1948 land of the Israeli state. Thereafter, everything else is continuing, but on the 5th of January 1996 is a significant event that took place, which was the assassination. So this assassination was of an individual known as Hafid Yahya Ayyash. He was known in Palestine as the engineer. So he was an engineer. He joined the Islamic resistance movement, and he was the individual who created the first explosives that were homemade explosives or internal made explosives within Palestine, and the first bombs. So all of the bombings that took place, he was the engineer and the manufacturer behind all of these bombs, and he was one of the leaders of the Qasim brigades in the West Bank. And he had been working from the early 90s, from the first Intifada until 1996. Obviously he was wanted by the Israeli authorities, and the intelligence had been searching for him for many years. Eventually, he'd been moving about, but he'd moved from the West Bank to North Gaza, a town in North Gaza called Beit Lahia, which is on the border or the edge of the Gaza Strip. But he was moving around mainly in Gaza at that time. And his father was his parents are in the West Bank. So there was a relative of Yahya Ayyash who was working with the Palestinian security services and was an informant for the Israeli authorities and the Israeli intelligence. So he found out that there was a man in Gaza in an area called Beit Lahia who was a childhood friend or from school and university of Yahya Ayyash, who Yahya Ayyash used to visit in order to call his father. So the Israeli intelligence, they gave this Palestinian man a mobile phone and they told him that give this to your nephew, because it was the nephew of this man who Yahya Ayyash used to visit. So he said, give this phone to your nephew and let him give it to the engineer when he comes to visit the home. And they cut the landline phone from this man's house so that the landline cannot be used and he would have to use this mobile phone. So the uncle of this man, he gives this individual the phone in response as payment for this. He asks for passports for himself and his family and some money and tickets to be able to fly to America and live in hiding. And so he is given this by the Israeli government. After the assassination, he flies to the US and lives in hiding. In any case, the Yahya Ayyash, he goes to his friend's house and he calls his father. He wants to call his father. The landline, he picks it up, the landline is cut, it's dead. So he says, do you have another phone? So he says, yeah, I've got a mobile phone that I've been given a new one, you can use that. So he calls using this phone. The authorities are obviously monitoring. As soon as the phone calls, they do a voice check. They said, yes, it's definitely him. He's calling from here. He's calling his parents. He's having us speak. So while they're there, they have put explosives inside the phone. They prepared this operation for 1 year, practicing, putting with dummies, putting phones on dummies in order to blow off the heads of those dummies for 1 year in preparation for this assassination. Then, as soon as they confirmed it was him, they detonated the explosives and he was killed. So this was a significant assassination for the Israeli forces, that they had been looking for him for a number of years. And he was the chief engineer for the Islamic resistance movement. Now, as part of this, we have the security services that have been set up by the Palestinian Authority, the PA. So the PA comes into being after Oslo. So until Oslo, there is no such thing as a Palestinian Authority. As part of the Oslo Agreement, we have the Palestinian Authority, who's the administration over these areas, and they are given security services. So initially, after 1993, they number a few thousand, maybe 18,000. Then eventually, by 1996, they number about 60,000. Numbers vary between 40 to 80,000, but approximately 60,000 Palestinian forces are members of the Palestinian Authority. So the police force and the intelligence, whatever name they may be given. Now their job was seen by generally the rest of the Palestinians to be Palestinians protecting the state of Israel, because their job was to stop any armed resistance and to curb terrorism. Now terrorism meant any kind of armed resistance to Israeli occupation. So that meant that their job was to go after all of the resistance and the members of the resistance who are living in the areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority. And so in this they had their own prisons, they had their own centers for interrogation techniques, where same as the Israeli occupation would use enhanced interrogation techniques on Palestinian prisoners, the Palestinian security forces were using enhanced interrogation against their own people when they were arrested, which led to the death and martyrdom of resistance fighters or members of the resistance in the prisons of the Palestinian security forces. And so they would raid their homes, they would arrest them, etc. Some would be released, many would stay in prisons for a while. There was also collaboration between the Shin Bet or the Shabak, the Israeli intelligence services, and the Palestinian security forces. So these Palestinian security forces, under the command of the or the cover of the Palestinian Authority, would inform the Israeli forces of the movements of resistance, members of the resistance within the West Bank and within Gaza, wherever they had any information. And the Israeli forces would then move in to capture these individuals or to arrest these individuals, etc., or to assassinate these individuals. Whenever the Israeli forces would come into villages to attack or raids, etc., they would first inform the Palestinian security forces that we're going to go and raid this village, or we're going to raid homes in this area, in this neighborhood. The Palestinian security forces would then move away from that neighborhood and make sure the route is clear for the Israeli forces to go and raid the Palestinian homes and those Palestinian villages and neighborhoods. And this continues until today. Whereas the Israeli forces, they in the West Bank, as we see, they raid places on a daily basis. Places are raided. The information is given to the Palestinian security forces from before. So they know in advance that the Israeli forces will raid this area or this location, and so they make sure that the route for them is open. They move away. Any kind of restriction in the path, so for example any kinds of explosive devices that are there to stop or hinder the Israeli tanks or military vehicles from entering into those towns or those camps, they are removed by the Palestinian security forces in order to let the Israeli military vehicles enter the camp unhindered without facing. They arrest any kind of resistance fighters who they can find and get there and able to capture. And so this was and continued to be a big hindrance to those who wish to do armed resistance against the occupation. And this continued as they would stop any kind of purchase of weapons, any kind of training for any of the members of any of these resistance movements, etc. And so this was a major setback in terms of the resistance against the occupation for the different Palestinian groups, as many of them were arrested by the security forces or informed about to the Israeli forces by the Palestinian security forces. Thereafter, as the attacks continued against Israeli targets, the Israeli government and the Benjamin Netanyahu himself gave the direct order that the leader of the leader outside of Palestine of the Islamic resistance movements, Hamas, at the time was Khalid Mish'al, and he's originally from the West Bank, but he had to leave the West Bank as part of his family left the West Bank due to the Nakba and the catastrophe in 1948, and therefore he was residing in Amman, the capital of Jordan. And the Islamic resistance movement had an office in Amman, in Jordan. In response to all these attacks, the order was given by the Prime Minister of Israel to assassinate Khalid Mish'al. And so a number of Israeli secret agents, they entered into Jordan, they entered into Amman, and close to the office where Khalid Mish'al was working, or close to where he was residing. And they came with tourist visas, dressed as tourists undercover. And as he was walking, two of them came close to him. Now his bodyguards were close by. Two of them came close, and they had a poison which they had prepared in advance. And this poison was to be injected from the ear. So they came close to him and they pressed He said he heard like a loud bang, etc. And this poison was injected into his body. Now the bodyguards of Khalid Mish'al became suspect of what's taking place. So they grabbed these agents and were able to chase the other ones. And the Jordanian security forces also arrested a few. Now, initially Khalid Mish'al didn't feel anything, but by the end of the day he became sick, he became vomiting, and he fell into a coma. At this point, the king of Jordan intervened, and he ordered the Israeli government, and he ordered Benjamin Netanyahu that he must come and deliver the antidote for the poison that has been administered to Khalid Mish'al. Initially, Benjamin Netanyahu refused. He said no. The king of Jordan, however, was very insistent. He spoke to the Americans and he said, listen, if the antidote is, if Khalid Mish'al was to die on Jordanian soil with an assassination, Jordan will enter into a civil war. This is something which is a red line. A political leader of any Palestinian movement cannot be assassinated on Jordanian soil. Jordan will burn, and I will not be able to remain as the leader of this country. So, in order to protect my interests and your interests, Khalid Mish'al, the antidote must be administered. The American government, the US government then intervened and told Netanyahu that he must send the antidote. Benjamin Netanyahu then sends the leader or the head of the intelligence agencies with the antidote to Amman, Jordan. It's administered to Khalid Mish'al, and Khalid Mish'al recovers from this assassination attempt. Khalid Mish'al recovers. As part of this agreement, so they had 2 Mossad agents in prison, and they also had a number of agents who were holed up inside the Israeli embassy. And the king of Jordan told the Israeli authorities, well, he told Benjamin Netanyahu that there is no way that I can release these agents and give them back to you without harming them or without imprisoning them or without taking them to trial, unless in addition to giving the antidote, you also release a number of prisoners. You release a number of Palestinian prisoners, and from amongst them, the one who needs to be released is Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Now you remember Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was arrested all the way back in 1988 at the start of the first Intifada. And so he's been in prison, in the Israeli prisons until this point in time. So they agree, and Sheikh Yassin, Ahmed Yassin is inside one of the prisons in Israel. He is called up to one of the rooms, to one of the offices upstairs. Initially he refuses. He refuses a number of times to go up and meet any of these the Israeli officers upstairs. But they say, no, you must go upstairs, you have to, it's important. So he doesn't know why he's being called. So they take him upstairs and then they tell him that you are going to be released in exchange for the agents who carried out the attempted assassination of Khalid Mish'al in Jordan, in Amman. So, however, the conditions of the release are that you will be exiled and you will have to live in Jordan. He says, if that's the case, send me back to the cell, I do not want to be released. I have my conditions. They said, what's the conditions? He said, to release me, first of all, you need to write down a piece of paper, and on this piece of paper it has to be an agreement between yourself and a promise that I am in Jordan only as a visitor and for treatment of my health. Thereafter, I will go back to Gaza, to my home, and I will not be exiled. Number 2, every single charge that you have brought against me, they will all be dropped, and you can never arrest me again on any of these charges. And he put in a number of conditions. They went to their seniors, they discussed, they agreed to these conditions. They brought him back, they said, we shall write these conditions down. So he said, okay, write down these conditions. So they're writing, obviously he's paralyzed, he can't write. They write down these conditions. He says, what have you written? Number 1. They say, this is what we've written. He says, no, I do not agree with this, how you've written. You need to write it like this. And so he goes through the whole agreement. Then the agreement ends and they say, okay, are you happy now? He says, no, there are 2 people in my cell who have been serving me for the past few months and they don't even know me from before. They need to be released alongside me. Now the two who are in the cell with him, they had both been in prison for 5 years, each of them 5 years. One of them sentenced to 12 years in prison, one of them sentenced to 8 years in prison. So they said, no, they cannot be released, these are high value prisons. He said, then send me back to the prison, I'm not being released. So they said, okay, then we'll release one of them. So he said, they said, okay, we'll release one of them. So they chose the one who had a shorter sentence, the one who was in prison for 8 years. Thereafter, he was released directly to his home. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was transported to Jordan. And Sheikh Ahmed Yassin at this point in time is 1997. Earlier on, he had, because of the lack of medical care in the prisons, his health had deteriorated drastically. He was, as we said initially, as soon as he entered the prisons, he was unable to walk anymore through the torture and the medical or lack of medical care that he received. He was eventually put in a prison or a hospital prison, and he was kept there until for a while. So eventually they fly him in a helicopter and they fly him to Amman in Jordan. And the helicopter lands and they tell him to come down from the plane. He says, where's the paper that you wrote the agreement on? They said, the paper, don't worry about it. He said, no, I will not come out the plane without the paper, without the agreement. So they talk amongst themselves and they eventually produce the agreement that has been written that he requested. He says, show me the agreement. He looks at the agreement, he says, there's no signatures on this agreement. I will not come out of the plane until you bring me back this agreement with signatures. And so the paper has to go back and the head of the intelligence agency signs the agreement. He said, no, I need 2 signatures, not 1. So then they go back and get the head of the Southern Command to also sign the agreement and bring it back. The agreement is signed. He then says, I want my ID documents. So the king of Jordan says to him, listen, you have everything, now you're going to go back, don't worry about the ID documents. He says, okay, and he agrees, and thereafter he comes out of the plane. And he is released. He spends a bit of time in Jordan. He gets some treatment in the hospital. Yasser Arafat goes to meet him in Jordan, and then returns back. And then Sheikh Ahmed Yassin is taken back to Gaza. Now, when he was imprisoned initially, he was not well known in Gaza, and he was not a famous individual in that sense. There were a few people who were following the movement, but the movement in Gaza hadn't reached such a stage where everyone was involved and there was a large public following. However, when he was released and he arrived in Gaza, the streets from the border were filled with people, and he was taken to a stadium, the main stadium, the sports stadium in Gaza, and the sports stadium was full. The stands were full, the grass was full, everything was full. He said there was not anything except people on top of each other welcoming him back into Gaza. And he did not realize how much during the years that he had spent in prison the resistance in Gaza had gained popularity. However, his health was very much deteriorated. He could only just about drink fluids with assistance with somebody else. He had infections in his ear, his eyes, where he almost lost his eyesight, almost lost his hearing. He had difficulty in speaking, infections in his throat. He traveled a few times for treatment to a number of countries. He went to Qatar. He also went to Haramain. He performed Hajj and Umrah in a number of travels before coming back to Gaza. After this agreement, the bombings basically stopped. The car bombings and the bus bombings that were taking place at that point in time, they stopped, but the resistance continued. So the armed resistance of clashes with Israeli forces continued in both from Gaza and also from the West Bank. So this was what took place all the way until 1997. And this continued under Netanyahu. There was not really much further agreements that were made. There was a few small agreements that were made in terms of, for example, in Hebron, where the forces were changed from being the Israeli forces to the Palestinian forces in terms of administration of the area, of the local area. However, there was not many meetings or many agreements that took place during the whole period of leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu as the Prime Minister of the Israeli government. Now, the agreements that took place from 1993 and then 94, then 95, and going through the years, these agreements were commented on by a number of individuals, whether they were Israeli negotiators, Palestinian negotiators, or historians. And from some of the comments that were made with regards to these negotiations, one of the key negotiator, who was an Israeli cabinet minister, who was the one who initiated the secret meetings before 1993, he said with regards to these agreements and the peace process, that for Israel the main issue is its security, that any future Palestinian state must be demilitarized. There will be no return to the 1967 borders. Or the pre-1967 borders. Now, initially the whole purpose of the negotiations was pre-1967 borders. But he specifically said, and he was the one who initiated the negotiations, that there will be no return. Palestinian refugees from 1948 will not be permitted into sovereign Israel. So the whole, the UN resolutions were the right of return. So the Palestinian refugees who were almost 1 million, over 750,000, 800,000 at the time of the Nakba and the catastrophe in 1948, they should be allowed back into their homes, which is part of the announced state of Israel, the 1948 borders, or pre-1967 borders. However, he said they will not be allowed back. Jerusalem will not be divided, meaning that Jerusalem, obviously until that point, was completely under Israeli control. And Jerusalem is supposed to be under Palestinian control, Al-Quds. However, he said Jerusalem will not be divided, it will stay under total Israeli control, and Jewish settlements will not be uprooted, meaning all of the settlements that have already been placed in these areas, they will not be removed in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, the first talks that took place, the Madrid talks, they were headed by an individual called Dr. Haidar Abdul Shafi, and when he was sidelined because he did not agree with the idea that any settlements could remain, and this was his red line. We discussed this when we discussed the Madrid peace talks. When he commented on the Oslo process, which was a process that was initiated just by the PLO and not agreed on by the Palestinian people, he said they made great sacrifices for a terribly flawed document. It was phrased in generalities that read into what was not there, meaning you couldn't understand exactly what they were trying to mean. There were multiple interpretations. The Israeli government had no intention of ever giving the Palestinians or ever allowing a Palestinian state. And so the difference in power, the asymmetry in power between Israel and the Palestinians, the negotiators were completely wrong in negotiating with the Israeli government in these negotiations. And Ilan Pape, who's an Israeli historian, he says that the Oslo Agreement is a wholly Israeli formula. There is nothing Palestinian in it. Through Oslo, Israel has succeeded in replacing one form of occupation with another. And so these are a few comments that were made by the by individuals who are involved in the negotiations, as well as a number of historians. And in reality, this is what took place. They had to do less work in terms of chasing the Palestinians, because they now had the Palestinian security forces who would do half of the work for them. So they would do all the groundwork for them, finding out where the resistance is, who the individuals are, where they are, what they do, build up their profiles, build up their folders, hand them over to the Israeli intelligence for the Israeli intelligence then to make moves. So they were, for example, the Palestinian Security Service would arrest certain individuals, then part of the other individuals who are linked to them, they would be arrested by the Israeli authorities. So this was with regards to the Oslo process. At the same time, when Benjamin Netanyahu comes into power, the settlements that were being built in the West Bank increase. So while they were only 125,000 initially at the beginning of the Oslo process, and the whole point of the process was to decrease the number of settlements, or at least the number of settlers, and definitely not increase. However, in those few years, the Benjamin Netanyahu, he accelerated the process of settlements. He accelerated the settlements. And so in this period, hundreds of thousands of settlers moved into the West Bank. Hundreds of thousands of settlers in these 5 years moved into the West Bank, and new settlements were set up in many different areas, under the areas that were under completely Israeli control and administration. And this was obviously a complete disregard to the agreement that had taken place in 1993 and then in 1994 and 1995 with regards to the cancellation or removal of certain settlements that was supposed to take place. In 1998, so towards the end of this term of his premiership, of him being the prime minister, there was American pressure to find or to continue the peace process. There was pressure to continue the peace process, as the US saw that in order to secure their interests and to secure the Israeli state and to reduce any kind of resistance, there needs to be some carrots given to the Palestinians, and therefore they will be happy to stay in the cage. However, if you leave a hungry bunny in the cage, it's going to get angry. So rather give it a few carrots, it'll stay happy. And so they insisted that the Israeli government continue with the peace process, and that the Israeli government continue to provide a mirage of peace and self-governance to the Palestinians, that there should be a continuation of the agreements which Benjamin Netanyahu had sort of backed out from once he came into power, as he did not agree with the whole peace process in the first place. So while the Oslo Accords had said, so a few examples, while the Oslo Accords had said 40% would be Palestinian administered, 60% Israeli administered, Benjamin Netanyahu only withdrew from 13%. He only withdrew from 13% of the whole West Bank and handed it over to the PA. The rest of it, he stayed in control, and the Israeli forces stayed in control. Now, the president of the US, Clinton, he was still Clinton at the time, he said he pressured the Israeli government into negotiations. So Netanyahu responded and said that there is an Israeli spy in the US who was spying on the US government. His name was Pollard. And Netanyahu said, if you release Pollard, send him back to Israel and release him, free him, then we will go into the peace talks. Clinton refused. Now, during the election process in the US, presidential elections, there was a backlash against Clinton from the Israeli lobby and the Zionist lobby. And so Clinton went to make a presidential decree that Pollard be released and sent back to Israel. That way he could get the lobby to support him. However, his security advisors last minute blocked his proposal or his decree, and Pollard was not released. However, as the American pressure was growing on this movement, so Benjamin Netanyahu in 1999, he calls early elections. As he did not want to be the prime minister who enters into any kind of peace process with the Palestinians and concedes anything or looks like conceding anything to them. So in February 1999, he decided he did not want to honor any of these agreements that had been made. There was one agreement that had been made while he was still the prime minister, which was called the Wye River Memorandum in October 1998. However, he did not honor this, So there were a number of the opposition party, they decided to put forward a motion of no confidence in the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. In response, he called an early election, and he lost the election. And he sort of knew that he was going to lose the election because of the political climate in at that time, and what would be forced and what the government would be required to do in terms of the peace process and agreements, etc., and what to concede to the Palestinians because of the American-US pressure. And so, in May 1999, after the elections, Netanyahu and his party lost, and Ehud Barak becomes the Prime Minister of Israel. During this period, Benjamin Netanyahu does carry out a number of other actions that obviously cause issues for the Palestinians. So, for example, in 1999, just before he calls the elections in January 1999, he desecrates the sanctity of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. He desecrates the sanctity of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and he orders a tunnel to be built under Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. And this was in September. In September, he orders a tunnel, or the construction of a tunnel that runs along the Al-Buraq wall of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. Obviously, this is a huge issue. This is Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, which is the masjid for the Muslims, and now by the Wailing Wall, he's planning to make a tunnel. And so the Palestinians, they react. There are protests, there are demonstrations. They become violent. The Israeli forces start shooting at the Palestinian demonstrators. The demonstrators have stones. They throw stones, and in altercations, over 70 Palestinians are killed and martyred. In these altercations, within 3 months, as they go back and forth, the demonstrations by the Palestinians against this move and decree by Benjamin Netanyahu, and hundreds of the Palestinians are wounded. Thereafter, Ehud Barak becomes the Prime Minister of Israel, and he attempts to continue with the peace process. And eventually this leads to the first intifada in the second intifada in the following years. Inshallah, we'll cover the period of Ehud Barak and the second intifada, Intifadat al-Aqsa, next week, inshallah ta'ala. Now, as you can see, over these years, the encroachment and entering Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa in the late 90s, from mid to late 90s, is increasing. It's increasing. We had the attempts to set up a place of worship during one of their ceremonies by Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and a number of the Palestinians were killed and martyred inside Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa massacre. Thereafter, we have a number of movements despite the peace process, altercations by Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. We have Al-Masjid Al-Khalil in Hebron, and then again we have Netanyahu going into Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and thereafter there were a number of events that took place as well, and therefore which eventually culminated in the Al-Aqsa, or Intifadat Al-Aqsa, the second Intifada. So inshallah we'll continue from here next week, inshallah ta'ala. Today, if there are any questions from what we've covered before we can close it for today, inshallah.
Yeah. So what were they hoping by working with the Israelis they would get like Palestinian state, or they'd get some stability? What was their motivation for claiming Israel?
Okay, so what were the motivations of the Palestinian Authority? Now, if you were to ask them, they said that we thought that there would be hope at that point in time, that there would be hope in the negotiations and the peace process, that we would be given a Palestinian state, and it's better than what we have now, which is nothing, in 1993. Because in 1993 the whole area was under total Israeli administration, Israeli rule. So at that time they said that these are their statements, that we will get at least something, even if we get an agreement of going back to the pre-1967 borders, and we can have some kind of self-administration and some kind of self-governance and self-rule that will give us some kind of autonomy. So these were the statements that were made. However, in reality, they did not gain autonomy for the Palestinians. The Palestinians continue to live under the rule, whether it be direct or indirect, of the Israeli authorities, because the Israeli authorities would dictate whatever the Palestinian Authority would do. In reality, on the ground, things were different. The Palestinians, or how a lot of the Palestinians saw it, was that, so initially a lot of the Palestinians were hopeful in 1993 that these negotiations are taking place. Hopefully we can achieve something. But many of the Palestinians, they quickly, over the next couple of years, when they saw that nothing is much is coming out of these negotiations, we can't really see any kind of independence and self-rule or self-governance. So many of them became despondent in the peace process and turned to supporting the resistance movements that was still doing armed resistance against the Israeli occupation. And many of them were not happy with the administration of the PA, which was mainly the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and those who were with him. And this was, if you remember previously, while they were in Jordan, the PLO, when they were in Jordan in the years during the 70s, there was a lot of internal corruption in terms of wealth, etc. And we discussed this in brief then. So this manifested when they became, as part of their power, within the Palestinian areas of the West Bank and Gaza. So many of those who were the leadership in the PA, before gaining any kind of power, they had nothing. They were sons of farmers, etc. They didn't really own much or have much property. But once they came into power, they had homes and large mansions, a lot of wealth. In fact, they were also the cause of a lot of anti-Islamic activities that took place. From casinos were built under their supervision, which they would control and get the profits from. Casinos, there were also places of filth, etc. They were involved in a lot of corruption in terms of finances. They would receive payments from agents working directly for the Israeli government in return to allow them safe passage within the Palestinian areas and inform on Palestinians to the Israeli government. And so there was a lot of corruption, which the people saw. They weren't happy with the governance that was taking place by the Palestinian Authority during all of these years, all the way for a decade until 2000, including the early 2000s, and continues until this day in the West Bank. So many of the Palestinians, in terms of the public, were not very happy with the way things were going on in terms of the administration in these areas. So while the leaders initially had said in 1993 that they had a hope that there would be some kind of self-governance, the general Palestinian public were not really very, let's say, hopeful, especially after the first couple of years, by 1995, 96 onwards, that anything would come of this, of the peace process. So that was the statements of their motivation initially. What became their motivation later on is something which, is a thing of the heart. So we can't really expose, but you can see signs of what the motivation possibly may have been. Any other questions? So previously, before he had set up the Islamic resistance movement in the 1980s, even before that, he had been asked to join the Fatah and the PLO. So he refused, and he refused on the basis that he did not believe that any kind of military. He refused on two grounds. One was that he did not agree with the corruption that was within the PLO and Fatah at the time, and also the anti-Islamic stance that they had. So that was one part. The other reason was that he did not, which was the main reason, which he said, was that the operations that they were doing at that time were all from other Arab countries. So they were from Egypt, from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Syria, and though none of those governments had the appetite to to deal with these kind of operations. They had, you could say, normalized sort of ties with the Israeli government, and so Jordan obviously had a treaty from before, as well as Egypt, and so they did not want any kind of operations happening from their soil in against the Israeli occupation, and so he expected that eventually it would lead to some kind of confrontation with those governments, and he did not want that to take place. He did not want any confrontation with any Arab government, and that's what eventually happened in Black September, when the fight took place between the Jordanian government and the PLO armed forces and Yasser Arafat, and eventually they had to go all the way to Lebanon. And then again in Lebanon, the Israeli army invades, and then they have to leave Lebanon. And Egypt was the same thing. The Palestinians groups were expelled from there by the Egyptian government. So those were the reasons. However, he always used to say that these are his views based on what he said was that these are Palestinian brothers. We are all members of the same nation, and we all wish to free the Palestinian people. And so he made a number of offers for these groups all to unite on a number of points. One was that the occupation, there would be the right of resistance for all Palestinians against occupation. Palestinian areas and Palestinians would not be demilitarized, because that would mean that they would have to give up all of their rights if only one side has weapons and the other side has no weapons. And a number of other points. He said it can be open for all the Palestinians to choose who can be their leader, etc. There were a number of attempts at, you could say, reconciliation, or to bring the groups together in terms of their views. So there was supposed to be a meeting in Saudi on one of the trips that was made by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin for his treatment. He was informed when he got there that Yasser Arafat will come to visit, and through an intermediary of the Saudi government, who will sit down and discuss an agreement between the PLO and the Islamic resistance groups. However, Yasser Arafat didn't turn up for the meeting. He came to Saudi, he stayed for one day and he left. So they didn't really come to any kind of agreement, although there were statements from both sides saying we wish to come to an agreement. Obviously, the criticism in terms of the Islamic side was always there, that they weren't implementing or acting in accordance with the Islamic principles of governance and administration, etc. Then with regards to the corruption, as we said. But in terms of the groups, they said we are all Palestinians, so we should work together. We have a common enemy in terms of the occupation, which we need to get rid of and remove. So that was the general view of the situation. Any other questions? No? Khair, inshallah. So inshallah, as we said, next week we'll start from 1999, 2000 onwards. So we're getting closer to where we are now. Inshallah, we ask that inshallah Allah Azza wa Jalla enables us and we finish until the modern day by Ramadan, before Ramadan, inshallah ta'ala. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla guide all the Muslims to make the correct decisions that will benefit the Ummah and not harm the Ummah. And we ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla enable us to serve the Ummah, be beneficial to the Ummah. Allah Azza wa Jalla grants us that knowledge which is beneficial, and enable us to serve the deen of Allah Azza wa Jalla in the way shown by the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla assist our brothers and sisters in Gaza, in Palestine, in and around Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, and all of our brothers and sisters around the world who are going through difficulties and who are oppressed. We ask that Allah Azza wa Jalla free the prisoners who have been unjustly imprisoned, and we ask that Allah Azza wa Jal cure those who have been injured and those who are sick. Allah Azza wa Jal accept the martyrs, and may Allah Azza wa Jal grant freedom, liberation, peace and security to our brothers and sisters around the globe. آمين وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.